In the summer of 2023, I traveled to the two Caribbean islands of Cuba and Grenada. Now, these two islands had a history of alliance during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. However, growing up in Florida, I was kind of indoctrinated to think very negatively about the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro. But traveling to Grenada, growing up, my family always seemed to have the opposite perspective about the Cuban Revolution and its leader. As a child, I was somewhat confused about this discrepancy, and this video is an attempt to explain the relationship between Grenada and Cuba, and how one Spanish-speaking country in the Caribbean could be perceived so differently by Grenadians versus a large segment of the American population. Now, with what happened to be the 200-year anniversary of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, which was a United States policy that made de facto claims to all the countries of the Western Hemisphere, I was curious to learn more about the relationship between these two revolutionary nations that dared stand up to the most powerful nations this world has ever seen, the United States and Great Britain. Now, in order to understand this relationship between the two nations, one has to go all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Now, after the United States received their independence from Britain in 1783, the British and the French had a tendency to pick on the young nation. France and Britain both wanted U.S. alliance in their wars against one another, and by the 1820s, when many Spanish-speaking colonies in the Americas were able to gain their independence due to Spain's preoccupation with the Napoleonic Wars, President James Monroe made a vow to stay out of the affairs of Europe while pledging to assist the newly independent Latin American countries in the defense of their freedom. However, all of this would come at a cost for the countries to the south of the United States. By the late 19th century and early 20th century, U.S. corporations from the United Fruit Company to Standard Oil controlled the land, the politicians, and resources in what would be termed the banana republics. As Britain still held on to many of their colonies in the Caribbean, and Spain still possessing Cuba and Puerto Rico until 1898, the people throughout the Caribbean and Latin America continued to resist imperial and colonial rule. In Cuba, a black revolution emerged to abolish slavery and secure independence from Spain starting in 1868, with the intermittent warfare ending in 1898. Cuba, which was a majority African descendant nation, created allies with their white brethren in an attempt to create a rainbow coalition of a movement for independence against Spain. 60% of the Cuban revolutionaries were of African descent, and at least 40% of those were commissioned officers as well. When word got out to the United States that Spain was on their way to losing the island to what they perceived to be an inferior black nation, the USS Maine conveniently explodes in the harbor of Havana. Now, without evidence, the United States immediately blames Spain, giving the United States the perfect justification to intervene in the war, and therefore secure a spot at the negotiation table when the Cubans win, who were well on their way to winning the war as it was. As soon as the United States intervenes, they segregate the Cuban military, they demote black officers, and they created a Jim Crow-style apartheid system in a country that worked so hard to rid itself of its racial disparities and animosities. For the next 60 years, the Platt Amendment determined that Cuba would be a colony of the United States in everything but name. And in an attempt to whiten the Cuban population, the United States-controlled government practiced a state-sponsored system known as blancamiento, where the government encouraged and sponsored the immigration of Europeans in Cuba throughout the early 20th century in an attempt to whiten the population. Cuba was a country where haves and landowners were white, and the have-nots and landless were brown and black. Until the Cuban Revolution of 1959, when the young nationalist Fidel Castro usurped the government from the U.S. puppet dictator Fulgencio Batista after their original failed attempt on July 26 of 1953 on the attack on Moncada Barracks. This would be the way of Cuba, a Platt Amendment-enforced, racialist, segregated society. Castro's government took hold of the private American banks, sugar plantations, casinos, hotels, beachfront properties, and other industries, in addition to taking the land from the land-owning Cubans. In a panic, the majority white population fled Cuba seeking refuge in South Florida. The Cubans that had everything to lose, well, they left. The Cubans that had everything to gain, the majority of whom were black and brown and landless, stayed and supported. Here I am at the 70th anniversary of the Asalte de Cartel Moncada, July 26, 2023.
All right.
Hoy es 26 de julio, asalta al cartel Moncada. Joder.
Yes, so it's a very special day. This is the day when Fidel Castro, he seized this very important building over here in Santiago de Cuba way back in 1953. So this is actually the 70th year anniversary of this occasion, this event. And this is what they say is the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. All right. So after this happened, there's some other incidents that happened. They eventually went out and fled to Mexico, and then they came back and they were in the Sierra Mountains planning the revolution that we all know about in 1959. All right. So this is like one of the early days of like their independence and stuff like that. All right. And ¿qué más tú sabes de la fecha?
No, baby.
So now we're on our way to another carnival event on the 26th of July, 2023, 7 years after the asalto a cuartel Moncada. Asalto a cuartel Moncada. ¡Allá!
On the other hand, Grenada, which was a British colony since the 18th century, imported an influx of Africans, making it an African island in the Caribbean with upward of 95% of the island being of African descent. After World War II in 1945, independence movements against colonialism were spreading all over the world. The world's colonial powers like Britain and France were devastated economically from the war, as well as morally bankrupt and hypocritical for fighting against regimes like Germany, Italy, and Japan, who attempted to conquer sovereign nations, while the Western powers simultaneously held colonies all over the world. The people throughout the colonial world, who were drafted to fight for their so-called colonial masters, turned the tide and began to fight for their own freedom, resulting in dozens of nations gaining their independence between the 1940s and the 1960s. By February 7, 1974, Grenada achieved their independence from Britain. However, like many of the independence movements, the regime under Prime Minister Eric Gairy was accused of being a neo-colonial puppet government representing British interests amid the Cold War. After 5 years of Gairy's repressive government, the Grenadian people rose up in a non-violent revolution on March 13, 1979. They established a leftist government that made significant strides in just a few short years. After 4 years of the revolution, the unemployment rate in Grenada went from 49% to just 14%. There were 2,500 new jobs in agriculture, 2,500 new jobs in construction, 500 new jobs in tourism, 65 schools were repaired. There was access to potable water that was doubled in the country. Grenadians received free health care and dental. Secondary school scholarships doubled. There were only 3 students studying abroad in that country before the revolution, and all of them were related to the prime minister. After 3 years of the revolution, 109 students were studying abroad. With the assistance of Cuba, the Grenadians constructed their first international airport during the revolution. And in 1981, Grenada was considered by the World Bank one of the few countries that experienced per capita growth in the Western Hemisphere. Much of the economic, medical, and educational growth was done with the assistance of the Cuban revolutionary government to the north. What do some of the Cubans and Grenadians have to say about this relationship?
Es interesante porque ya de entrada tendríamos que ya empezar a analizar que son 2 islas pequeñas, islas del Caribe, que fueron incluso colonias de distintos tipos de colonialistas. En el caso de Granada, es como un país de habla inglesa, pues bueno, ellos hablan, su idioma principal es el inglés. Nosotros somos cubanos que hablamos incluso el español por España y además hubo otras colonias, pero bueno, no viene al caso, la que más estuvo, que predominó fue España. No obstante, siempre pensamos como el acercamiento geográfico que tiene Granada con Cuba, con las palmeras, los cocoteros, el gran sol, el Caribe. O sea que hay un símil desde el punto de vista geográfico y caribeño que nos pudiera identificar, y sobre todas las cosas a partir de que el vínculo que tuvo en 1980 y algo, el presidente Bichó, que además nos encantaba como persona, tenía un liderazgo muy particular que nos gustaba a los cubanos, y él se vinculó mucho con el comandante jefe de nosotros, el histórico comandante jefe Fidel Castro, y nosotros apoyamos a Granada hasta tanto pudimos, pero el vínculo fue muy fuerte. Los cubanos se vincularon desde el punto de vista de la construcción y posiblemente hasta académico, se hizo cosas con Granada porque se estrecharon lazos con el comandante de aquí y Bichó muy fuertes, y Cuba no duró tal vez tanto lo que esperábamos, pero siempre Fidel Castro guardó mucha confianza y le interesó mucho el liderazgo de Bichó, y nos encantaba, como explicaba anteriormente, cómo trataba de sacar su pueblo hacia adelante, luchaba por los derechos de izquierda, o sea, de las personas, que el pueblo tuviera prosperidad y evitar un poco la desigualdad que hay en la región. Y entonces él hizo lo que pudo, y desafortunadamente eso se tronchó y sufrimos mucho porque bueno, Cuba, hasta recuerdo que había un aeropuerto que se estaba trabajando, había muchos cubanos que trabajaron fuerte en la construcción, y ahí al menos nosotros los cubanos sabemos que tenemos una impronta, que tenemos ahí un pedazo de Cuba en Granada.
Again, we were young and we were enthusiastic and we were rebellious, we were revolutionary, and we looked to Cuba as one of the countries that would have succeeded in its revolution, and anti-imperialism sort of posture, you know. So we did that. We did that at an early age, basically. You know, we did that at quite an early age, and they were successful in a sense. And then this is where the solidarity built up, because we felt that America, as big and as rich and as powerful as she was, down in our backyard in the Caribbean, taking advantage, setting up an embargo, restricting food, restricting energy, restricting everything from that country. Obviously, it's your neighbor. And your neighbor house on fire, you gotta watch yours. So we were looking at, you know, because what they were doing was progressive. They were educating their population. There would have been some, and in that process, you have certain, what you may call dictatorial sort of, you know, measures that must be taken. You know, or else you'll get lawlessness. You see, you'll get lawlessness, and but this is something that must evolve and grow, and go beyond that type of dictatorial sort of, you know, posture. So for us, we were guided to a large extent by what we saw happening in the Cuba Revolution, and to protect against that. In other words, not to develop any sort of hostility, but to sort of try to you know, work along with the big nations as well, you know. But they refused to work with us, in particular America, And this is why, but we have since mended that thing, you know, but it has left a scar on Grenada up to today.
Yeah.
You know? And but in the eyes of the world, our revolution was a successful revolution up to the point that it lived.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, in terms of transforming people thinking, you know, our perception of Cuba in the early 70s was wow, but you know, America painted it in a certain way.
Yeah.
But because of our consciousness and our ability to link up internationally, we understood what was happening in Cuba.
Yeah.
And we understood that it was a question of America suppressing the people, the economy, everything in Cuba.
And dominating.
And dominating,
yeah.
you know, the situation. And we were able to learn from that as well.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Nice.
So,
like that. And then they know a lot of people, especially a lot of the older people, they know a lot about Maurice Bishop and everything like that. So I went there and I was asking people like questions and things. And there was this girl that I met that I showed her one of the Grenada video that I did with Maurice Bishop.
Reasons and excuses, some of them credible, some utter rubbish.
And she was like, "Oh, I went to Maurice Bishop Elementary School." So I was like, "You had a Maurice Bishop Elementary School in Cuba?" She's like, "Yeah."
En la primaria estudié en la escuela se llama Mauricio Bishop, se llama así la escuela. Desde los 6 años hasta los 12 años de escolaridad. En esa escuela pasé prácticamente toda mi infancia, allí fue donde aprendí todo. Se encuentra ubicada en Santiago de Cuba, en la zona del distrito José Martí.
And then, so I was like, so now that I'm here, I want to see like what Grenadians think about, you know, the Cuban Revolution, make that connection and see if there's a relationship or anything like that. Yeah.
Well, the Cuban Revolution to me, it was a progressive revolution. We expected, we did expect that America would portray the Cuba in a negative kind of light. Now, the reason for that is because they didn't adhere to the wishes or the dictates of America, right? Cuba had they charted their own way. So America referred to them or insisted that they were communists.
The real reason for all of this hostility is because some perceive that what is happening in Grenada can lay the basis for a new socio-economic and political path of development. They give all kinds of reasons and excuses, some of them credible, some utter rubbish. There's an interesting one that we saw very recently in a secret report of the State Department. I want to tell you about that one, so you can reflect on that one. That secret report made this point, that Grenada is different to Cuba and Nicaragua, and the Grenada Revolution is in one sense even worse, I'm using their language, than the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions, because the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada speaks English and therefore can communicate directly to the people of the United States. But I want to tell you what that same report also said, and said that also made us very dangerous. And that is that the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada are predominantly black. They said that 95% of our population is black, and they had a correct statistic. And if we have 95% of predominantly African origin in our country, then we can have a dangerous appeal to 30 million black people in the United States.
question. At what point did a lot of people start getting hip to, I guess, this anti-imperial revolutionary movement that was going on here?
I would say that would have occurred during the 70s, early 70s.
Yeah.
It would have emerged out of the Black Power movement.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And the Black Power consciousness is what would have given rise to this sort of global solidarity, if I may put it that way.
Yeah.
Right? And Cuba being the closest with a sort of and a certain level of nationalism.
Yeah.
You see? The Black Power movement, and you had this, well, nationalism would have been before, right? And then you had the emergence of this Black Power movement and this kind of global consciousness and this anti-imperialist concept, right? Theory or practice, in the sense that you had these multinational corporations sort of dominating our culture, our eating habits, our diet, and these things. And there would have been this need among our people to be more self-reliant, to be more, independent, right? And that is where you would have looked at Guyana in those days. The Cooperative Republic of Guyana, they were way ahead in a sense, and you had people like Dr. Walter Rodney, right, and so forth. So we would have been sort of looking at our neighbors in a sense, and their fight against imperialism, and America in a sense, imperialism. Europe, of course, same thing, and they may have been even worse because they really enslaved us. They loot, they plunder, they rape all of our resources to build their empire, right? And that is where our consciousness would have come in and say, well, we need to be more independent. We need to, and look at Cuba, we look at Guyana, and so forth, and that's what gave rise to this sort of relationship with what you call a progressive country like Cuba.
Así, eso fue en el 60, cuando fue a New York, que estuvo en el Parque de Teresa.
Sí, para conocer Malcolm X.
Sí, entonces hubo muchas discrepancias, porque los grandes magnates, los contrarrevolucionarios que también ahí iban o suben de la Florida, no querían que el gobierno americano atendiera a Fidel. Pero Fidel, como era más inteligente que todos ellos, una gente de mucha cabeza pensante, dice, no, yo me acuesto a dormir aquí, entonces no como aquí. Y los negros que tenían clase alta también, que sí los hay, dice, no, usted va a dormir en tal lugar y usted va a comer tal cosas. Y entonces todos los negros, aplausos ovacionados, y atendieron muy bien de manera especial a Fidel.
Let me ask you, Mr. X, why did you visit Fidel Castro this morning?
Well, you have to understand it like this. Because of the climate that has been produced by the trouble in Africa, in the Congo, in Kenya, and other places, it has caused a great deal of tension in Harlem. And based on that, some representatives from the 28th Precinct a few weeks ago visited our restaurant, and they were discussing these incidents that stemmed from this tension, and they asked us for suggestions on some of the best ways to combat it. So we suggested that they, instead of condemning the leaders of these different nationalist groups, that they get all of them together at the Amsterdam News Office, where they have the 28th Precinct Community Council at the Amsterdam News Office. I think it's once a month. Whenever you are involved with a man as controversial as Dr. Castro and as controversial as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, you don't just make statements that you don't explain, because people take them and twist them and make more out of them than what you mean.
I'm listening.
Now,
so you were at the Teresa.
So we left. After they had brought Dr. Castro in, we left. And then we received a call at our restaurant at 116th and Lenox. I got to get that plug in. Best restaurant in New York.
You'll pay for that, pal.
And they asked us to come to the Teresa Hotel that Dr. Castro wanted to see us. I was shocked.
Yeah.
And but we got the committee together and went back. When we went back with the Muslims, the police let us through their lines.
Right.
We were led by them up to the 9th floor and into Dr. Castro's room. And he greeted us very cordially, and he greeted us very cordially. We sat down. The room wasn't so big, and in fact it was crowded with his entourage. And we were allowed to take in, I think, about 5, 2 Negro reporters and a cameraman and 4 of the brothers. And so that was that.
Eso lo dejó bien claro. El Hotel Teresa. Sí, yo le dije el nombre.
Sí.
Sí, que es el Hotel Teresa. Que todavía eso existe ahí. Y creo que se dice que todavía que ahí estuvo el comandante jefe. No sé si conservan atrás algo que se hizo para determinar que Fidel Castro estuvo allí en ese hotel y todas esas cosas. ¿Existe todavía?
Sí, existe todavía, sí.
Entonces,
porque yo tengo una foto de el dirigente de Civil Rights, se llama Malcolm X.
Malcolm X.
Sí, Malcolm X estaba con Fidel en ese hotel.
Sí, porque era el líder de los derechos civiles.
Sí.
Y daba muchos discursos. Era un hombre que estaba muy floreciente en ese momento.
Sí.
Y los americanos negros lo querían mucho porque él luchaba mucho por los derechos civiles de los negros en Estados Unidos. Y se retrató con Fidel, hizo muchos vínculos con Fidel desde el punto de vista político para mejorar el mundo, como lo hizo con Malcolm X, como lo hizo con Mandela, con grandes líderes mundiales también para luchar.
Sí,
con Mandela fue igual y todo.
Porque Castro mandó muchos guerreros en África para pelear contra apartheid.
El apartheid, sí.
Apartheid.
Nosotros sí, y Fidel entonces con los vínculos con África, porque África es un continente que ha sufrido mucho y ha luchado y le han usurpado todo lo que tiene.
Sí.
Y entonces ellos pidieron ayuda y Fidel estuvo en África Austral, Suráfrica, en África del Norte, estuvo en muchos lugares y para luchar contra el apartheid, casualmente, o apartheid. Y entonces dejó una impronta en África porque hubo resultados en muchas naciones que estaban todavía colonizadas.
Sí.
Y cuando Fidel mandó ahí, ellos lucharon y sacaron a toda esa contrarrevolución. Y hoy día hay muchos que son independientes porque gracias a la revolución cubana y a todo lo que hizo Fidel por África. Todavía hay gobiernos y pueblos que sí nos agradecen eso. Lo hizo mucho por Angola, hizo mucho por Namibia, también con Etiopía, y todavía sigue.
Y la primera persona que Nelson Mandela quería unirse estaba Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro, me consta.
Y los Estados Unidos querían saber por qué tú quieres unir con Fidel Castro. Pero Mandela dijo que porque él estaba ayudando a mi país, él estaba ayudando a la gente. Cuando los Estados Unidos estaban al otro lado de la guerra, los Estados Unidos estaban apoyando la guerra, apartheid,
la desigualdad, la colonización, el racismo, la xenofobia, todo eso lo apoyaba. Entonces ellos saben lo que hacen, ellos hacen los fuegos, ay no, tú esto, ellos sabían lo que perseguía Mandela y lo que perseguía, lo que quería Fidel y Mandela a nivel global, un mundo mejor y todas esas cosas.
Bueno.
Por eso odiaban tanto a Fidel, pero al final le dieron tanta fama a Fidel Castro que Fidel Castro hoy día es uno de los grandes líderes mundiales, por la misma fama que le dieron los americanos y por la cantidad de atentados que tiene, récord Guinness de atentados, más de 600 atentados, una cosa loca, y no pudieron con él. Como decimos los cubanos, está montado.
Sí.
O sea, que era una creencia que la protegía.
At the same time, when the racist South African apartheid regime was attempting to spread apartheid into Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, also Angola and Mozambique, the Cuban revolutionary government did as they had done in Grenada, assist in the black revolutions of the African against white imperialism. While the United States and Israel continued to support the aggressive imperial invasion by apartheid South Africa into its neighboring countries, the small island nation of Cuba, under Castro's leadership, sent 30,000 troops in 1975 and 1976 alone, and 1,000 aid workers. However, this was not the only assistance that Cuba gave to Africa. Shortly after the Cuban Revolution in 1962, Castro sent in troops into the North African country of Algeria to assist the people in their liberation campaign against the French. As Malcolm X stated in his message to the grassroots in November of 1963,
"The Black Revolution is sweeping Asia, sweeping Africa. It's rearing its head in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, that's a revolution. They overturned the system."
It was this Cuban Revolution that Malcolm was mentioning that sacrificed in the liberation movement throughout Africa from the early 1960s into the 1980s. By 1964 and 1965, there were hundreds of Cuban troops, led by Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara, sent into Zaire, which is the present-day Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, the Republic of Congo, and other parts of Central Africa. In 1966, Cuban military instructors and doctors were sent to Guinea-Bissau to assist in their anti-colonial struggle against the Portuguese and remained there until 1974. But it was in Angola, in 1975, where the Cubans experienced the most success in their anti-colonial movement against the Portuguese and preventing the spread of South Africa's apartheid racist regime into the region. This is precisely why Fidel Castro was the first head of state that Nelson Mandela wanted to thank when he was released from prison in 1990.
Those of us who share your struggle for human rights and against apartheid have been somewhat disappointed by the models of human rights that you have held up since being released in jail. You've met over the last 6 months 3 times with Yasser Arafat, who you have praised. You have told Gaddafi that you share the view on, and applaud him on his record of human rights and his drive for freedom and peace around the world. And you have praised Fidel Castro as a leader of human rights and said that Cuba was one of the countries that's head and shoulders above all other countries in human rights, despite the fact that documents at the United Nations and elsewhere show that Cuba is one of the worst. I was just wondering, are these your models of leaders of human rights? And if so, would you want a Gaddafi or an Arafat or a Castro to be a future president of South Africa?
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies.
Now Mandela makes an excellent point. This could apply for the black populations in the United States and throughout the African diaspora as well. The so-called black experience in America would lend to it that, due to the historic nature of the relationship between the U.S. government and black people, one would find that blacks have often fought on the side of America's enemies, or at least had significant underground movements that supported them. During America's War for Independence, 20,000 African Americans fought on the side of the British versus the 5,000 that fought on the side of the American Continental Army. During the War of 1812, there were mass movements of self-emancipating Africans as well as natives who fought on the side of the British against the United States. During the Philippine-American War, there was an African American by the name of David Fagan who went AWOL and fought for the Philippines, and became an officer fighting against Americans in a war which the United States was responsible for the death of 200,000 civilians, all in the name of liberating the Philippines from Spain. In the years leading up to World War II and during the war itself, there were pro-Japan black organizations like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey, the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad, and Japanese organizations like the Black Dragon Society here in the United States that had been making an appeal to the black American community for years. For black Americans and blacks throughout the diaspora to take a position that was contrary to the United States and the West was completely in line with history.
Sí. Evidentemente, sí, todos los gobiernos que pasaron de turno también discriminaban a los negros, pese a que Batista era un mulato.
Sí.
ellos también explotaban a los negros. Todos los gobiernos esos que salieron antes de Fidel eran muy agresivos con el pueblo. Sí. Algunos prometían más escuelas, tenían el lema como todo, igual hoy día las mismas campañas de Estados Unidos, esa gente, no los socialistas, que no tenemos campaña como tal, a no ser algunos del sur que dicen hambrecero, esto y lo otro, como Brasil, pero nosotros no tenemos campaña para el pueblo. Fidel tenía su propio plan, sí, y lo hizo. Pero ellos, por ejemplo, ahora te dicen, más escuela, te voy a hacer Biden, entonces las mismas gente, pero Cuba no dice más escuela, más esto. Cuba hizo un proyecto y lo divulgó, pero en la práctica, cuando estaban los gobiernos anteriores, hicieron muchos destrozos con el pueblo. Hubo demasiada miseria, que creo que te lo dije al principio. La mayoría de los muchachos, la gente estaban descalza, no había recursos, claro, no había ni dinero. Las cosas antes de la revolución costaba, la libra eran centavos, Mario, ¿no? 10 kilos, 15 kilos, una libra de pan, un medio, centavo, era cents. Wow. Fíjate cómo estaba la cosa, que no había ni pesos grandes para hablar. Eran de centavos que se hablaba, cierto o falso, porque no había nada. No había economía, no había sencillamente nada. Estaban toda esa gente mandando en el país y no había recursos. Todo se concentraba en la gente que tenía el poder económico en ese momento en Cuba. Incluso te digo más, que es contradictorio, porque antes de la revolución fuimos los primeros países en el mundo que teníamos telefonía. Telefonía, sí, de casa, porque la móvil es más contemporánea. Sí. Teníamos telefonía. Fuimos los primeros en tener tranvía y los ferroviarios, transporte ferroviario, de trenes, todas esas cosas. Fuimos de los primeros. Fuimos de los primeros en tener también electrificación, y teníamos CMQ y todas las grandes emisoras, y aquí la gente tenía, cuando triunfó la revolución, hasta en los campos, la gente tenía electrificación, tenía electricidad. Que ante el capitalismo casi nadie tenía, se alumbraban con mechones, y ya cuando triunfó Fidel, todas esas cosas, en ese momento había todo eso, había su electrificación antes de, pero después, eso era la única parte buena que pudieras decir, que había electricidad, que había gas, sí, que había todo lo que te estoy diciendo, pero sin embargo, todo lo que había del gobierno estaba concentrado en una minoría. Sí. Que esas cosas no usaban tampoco todo el mundo, que ya entonces tenían poco, pero cuando triunfa Fidel se pone entonces la electricidad para el peso. Ya. Pero se existió, como país lo teníamos, o sea que éramos pioneros, que no era un país que era una islita, que era pobrecita, teníamos telefonía y teníamos todo eso, o sea que gozamos con eso, con un poquito de desarrollo en cuanto a determinadas tecnologías, que sí, pero todas esas cosas no eran para las mayorías, no eran participativos a nivel social. Sí, no, sí. Todo sí, siempre ha sido discriminatorio.
Teníamos todo eso porque todo eso era americano.
Exactamente, eran de compañías norteamericanas.
Sí, los hoteles, las playas, los bancos,
sí, teníamos todo eso, pero todo era de ellos.
Para ellos. Todo era para ellos, exactamente, que era lo que tenía que decir. Teníamos todo eso, pero eran compañías americanas y todos esos bienes salían del país. Eso no, el cubano normal, bajo, no lo veía, sí, porque eran compañías americanas. Sí. Entonces es ahí el key de la cosa, que ves.
Pasa adelante.
Que ves la desigualdad que había.
Adelante, puede pasar.
Y yo te digo que en definitiva sí hubo cosas que heredamos del capitalismo, sí, pero y al final después no la quisieron quitar, pero le hicieron daño porque el pueblo no la disfrutaba de manera general. Que fue las cosas que Fidel entonces cambió.
Now, though racial discrimination still exists in Cuba, as it does all over the world, the revolutionary government made a conscious effort to desegregate the country, promote the existence of the African religions that were concealed under the American regimes, and promote the African self-emancipation movements throughout the history of the country. When Castro died in 2016, the Cubans in the streets of Miami celebrated with a great passion.
And News Channel 5's Gabrielle Serran is live in Little Havana, which is one of the most heavily Cuban-populated areas in the country. Gabrielle, how are people reacting now?
What an incredible mood. This crowd does not stop. What was a party all night night long has turned into a party all morning long next to Cafe Versailles. Take a look at the crowd. Hundreds of people here lining Southwest 8th Street, drivers passing by, people in their cars, waving Cuban flags, waving American flags with pride. This is all things Cuban out here. People sipping Cuban coffee, smoking their Cuban cigars, all here wanting to be a part of history. Now I've seen different generations here, from teenagers to abuelas or grandmas, dancing into the night, sharing their stories. Fidel Castro brought social reform to Cuba, but he's certainly a polarizing figure and one widely disliked here. You know, some people I spoke to blame him for tearing families apart, losing everything when they left the island during and after the Cuban Revolution.
Those were the Cubans that left. And these were the Cubans that stayed in Cuba.
Yes, but the problem is that Miami is not the best place to work
for
Cubans, you know.
Yeah.
And this is Miami is different. The Miami is, they say that it's Cuba, but it's not Cuba. It's like the people that live in Miami, they still have the resents of the government, you know. Yeah. That they still living a lot of people who left Cuba during the 60s, during the 80s, They have another point of view.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
They have another point of view.
The Cubans that left Cuba in the 60s and 70s are different than the Cubans that
they
live now.
felt betrayed by Cuban people who come here, you know, because suppose that they are supporting the
revolutionary government. Yeah,
and that's a problem. That's a problem nowadays for some people. You know, it's a problem coming to Cuba. From Miami, for instance, and they to go back to Miami, then sometimes they are punished, sometimes they are segregated, because if you support the government, not if you support the government, if you just come here and support your family, they think that you are supporting the revolution, and then that's a problem. Now that we have people in Cuban people are split.
Yeah.
No, la diferencia, obviamente es una diferencia muy notable, porque a ver, nosotros triunfamos el 59 cuando Fidel le dio el golpe de Estado a Batista. Entonces Fidel era un hombre de clase alta, era rico, sin embargo su familia era terrateniente de origen español, él vivía en Verán, en el oriente cubano, y él tenía un alma de desarrollar el país. Y Fidel era un hombre de luz larga, siempre un hombre muy iluminado, a pesar de su clase alta, de su familia, él siempre pensó en el bienestar de su pueblo. Había mucha desigualdad, en ese tiempo había mucha hambre, había mucha miseria, habían bohíos, entonces el país estaba sumido en una miseria descomunal. Aquí en ese momento también parte de los americanos, antes que triunfara la revolución, también tenían acciones aquí. Fidel llegó y en el 59 le dio el golpe de Estado a Batista y ya se hizo una revolución socialista. Y entonces Fidel empezó a darle escuelas a los cubanos, a darle casas, a coger los ingenios y a intervenir las cosas que eran del pueblo, que estaban los americanos y otros gobiernos, otra gente de Europa, en fin, había mucha gente que estaba en Cuba con acciones y tomando las cosas nuestras. Y Fidel llegó y le quitó las cosas que eran nuestras, porque las cosas de valor nacional, la electricidad, el gas, el agua, todas esas cosas son del pueblo, no son de una minoría. Entonces él empezó a hacer una revolución social muy interesante y nosotros vimos el fruto. Yo era muy joven cuando eso, y era niña, y entonces soñé mucho y estaba muy ilusionada con todas las cosas que hizo Fidel para el pueblo. Y efectivamente, esas personas que me hablas de la Florida, cuando triunfa la revolución, ellos se van porque no les gusta el sistema social. Ellos tienen una ideología diferente a la que Fidel creó. Entonces, efectivamente hubo un éxodo muy grande en esa etapa, al 60, 61, por ahí. Se fueron mucha gente que tenían una posibilidad económica más alta y algunos otros no, pero bueno, hubo un éxodo grande hasta la operación Peter Pan de los niños, esa historia que eso se pudiera ver en otro momento. Y la gente se fue al exilio, pero porque eran disidentes, o sea, estaban en desacuerdo con las cosas. Fueron para allí, para Miami, se han concentrado hasta hoy día y siguen allí. Muchos han cogido cargos importantes en el gobierno, como Marco Rubio, Elvira, la famosa loba feroz, que ahora incluso ya está retirada. Y hay muchos más que la lista sería interminable, pero esos son muy activos hoy día para atacarnos desde el punto de vista político. Y entonces es terrible todas las diferencias que hay, porque ellos aspiran a que esta revolución se termine, porque ellos quieren venir y tomar a Cuba con el derrocamiento del comunismo, porque ellos le llaman comunismo. Están perdidos, porque el comunismo no existe. El comunismo como concepto, el comunismo es que todos seamos iguales, que sea la igualdad de los pueblos, que todos tengamos bienestar, que no haya diferencias de clase, y ese concepto no va a existir. No. Eso nada más lo creo yo, que ya soy una persona de bastante edad. Eso lo creo para los libros, eso es una utopía. De todas maneras, soñar no cuesta nada, pero no va a llegar. Entonces ellos están arremetiendo con Cuba, arremetiendo con los cubanos, tergiversando la realidad, y por eso hay muy malas relaciones con ellos, porque son de nuestra tierra, pero son malos. Ya no solo con el gobierno, porque a lo mejor tú dices, bueno, si lo que dicen perjudican al gobierno, no. Pero el tema es que nos están perjudicando a nosotros como pueblo. Entonces no podemos tolerar eso. Entonces ese es el gran problema que tiene la Florida con nosotros. Que no nos vamos a dar la lengua, no vamos a ser amigos mientras ellos sigan con esa política de hostilidad. No nos entendemos.
In the 1960s and 70s, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was a revolutionary black movement in the United States who organized black communities throughout the country to push back against the tyrannical exploitation of the government. They exercised their right to bear arms, to defend themselves against police brutality. They created breakfast clubs in the mornings to feed the youth before there was a federal program in the United States. In these breakfast programs, they educated the youth. They also set up clinics throughout the black community to address local concerns of the community, such as battles with sickle cell anemia. The federal and state governments, along with the FBI and local police departments, stepped in to neutralize this black organization. The government engaged in assassinations of members, theft, illegal searches and seizures, peddling of drugs, and other types of illegal subterfuge. Law-abiding members of the Black Panther Party, once faced with the reality of a U.S. government breaking its own laws, decided to go underground and form the Black Liberation Army. One of the members was a young Assata Shakur, the godmother of the late rapper Tupac Shakur. Because of her affiliation, she was accused of killing a police officer and sentenced to prison. However, she broke out of jail, and guess which country decided to take her in. Cuba. Assata Shakur has passed in Havana, Cuba in recent weeks. But this is to remind us, as Nelson Mandela once said,
one of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies.
Thanks for watching. The end.